Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, are you all recovered from our all-night election session last Thursday?
You know what? It's just been too many elections, Michael. I'm knackered. I think I need some good old-fashioned authoritarian dictatorship so I can at least get a nap.
I know. Every 5... Do we really have to have them every 5 years? This is crazy. Obviously, we have been having them more often than every 5 years in most European countries recently. But I have to say, the last 72 hours or so, the results haven't been so bad. We will be beginning the show by moving over to France and talking about the surprisingly positive election results there. For the rest of the show, we'll be looking at the first few days of Keir Starmer's government. Do stay tuned for all of that.
Il est 20h et on découvre la nouvelle assemblée et ce n'est pas le tiers.
That was the moment left-wing activists in Paris discovered the Nouveau Front Populaire was set to become the largest party grouping in the French parliament. The success of the French left pushes Macron's centrist grouping into second place in parliament, but more importantly, it means that against all expectations, the French far right were pushed into third place. In total, the left-wing New Popular Front won 182 seats in the legislature. Macron's Ensemble alliance won 168 seats. The far-right National Rally and their allies won 143 seats. And the centre-right alliance, led by Les Républicains, won just 60. Jean-Luc Mélenchon of the left-wing La France Insoumise celebrated like this.
The elements on the left are united and have shown that they were able to deal with this extraordinary historical situation, and in its way, it's been able to avoid what was going to happen. Once again, it saved the Republic. We saved the Republic. And once again, we can begin to work on ecological matters, social matters, and our people, our time, our world, our Europe need.
That was Mélenchon saying that unity among the left had saved the Republic. He is right about left unity, of course, but it was also the agreement by the left and the centre to stand down in constituencies where the other was best placed to defeat the far right that helped achieve this result. And that was an agreement which the national rallies, Jordan Bardella, tried to paint in a sinister light.
Malheureusement, l'alliance du déshonneur et les arrangements électoraux dangereux passés par Emmanuel Macron et Gabriel Attal avec les formations d'extrême gauche privent ce soir les Français d'une politique de redressement qu'ils ont pourtant plébiscité largement en nous plaçant en tête des élections européennes, puis dimanche dernier, lors du premier tour avec près de 34% des suffrages exprimés. Ce soir, ces accords électoraux jettent la France dans les bras de l'extrême gauche de Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
That was Bardella complaining of an alliance of dishonour entered into by President Macron and Prime Minister Gabriel Attal that he said had handed France to the far left under Mélenchon. One might, of course, think that tactical voting to keep the far right out shows an electoral system working well. It's not a dastardly alliance. That's an alliance which actually respects the opinion of the French people, which is evidently that they don't want to be governed by the far right. What is without doubt, though, is this: the election outcome was not what Macron had planned when he called the election just weeks ago. Macron had assumed a divided left would make the contest a head-to-head between his party and the far right. Instead, the left got their act together and have come out on top. It's a defeat recognised by the centrist Prime Minister Attal, who last night offered his resignation.
Tonight, the political group I represented in this campaign, even if it scored 3 times more than what was predicted in recent weeks, does not have a majority.
Ne dispose pas d'une majorité. Ainsi,
and so, being loyal to Republican tradition and to my principles, I will hand in my resignation letter to the president.
Ma démission au président de la République. Je sais qu'à la lumière des résultats de ce soir,
I know that in light of the results tonight, many French people feel a form of uncertainty over the future because no absolute majority has come out of it. Our country is experiencing an unprecedented political situation and is preparing to welcome the world in a couple of weeks. That said, I will of course do my duties as long as it's needed.
Aussi longtemps que le devoir l'exigera.
Macron has today said that Attal's duties are needed a little bit longer, so he will stay on as Prime Minister, presumably until another can be confirmed. It's unclear how or when that might happen. There's big differences between the top two parties at this election. In the meantime, the defeat of the far right and victory for the left is for many, above all, a relief.
I'm still moved. It's incredible. We're relieved. There is a lot of hope. There is a lot of hope for the future of France, for the left. What is happening here is historic. It's a liberation.
I'm a dual national, Franco-Algerian, so for weeks I was afraid for my life and I said to myself, maybe I'll think about leaving just for the sake of my life and that of my loved ones. But now I can't quite bring myself to do it. All I do is cry because the one thing I keep telling myself is, we're safe.
I'm joined now by Alice Capel, a French journalist and fellow YouTuber. Welcome back to Novara Live. To begin, how big a surprise was this?
Honestly, it was a big surprise. When we checked the polls in the past few weeks, it seemed that the National Rally was going to win. It seemed that the Popular Front was getting more and more attention, more and more points here and there. But we weren't expecting that the National Rally would end up in third position and that the Popular Front would be first. I guess another surprise as well was the number of seats that the majority. So Macron's group got. It's important to keep in mind, though, that a lot of the seats that they got were the results of left-wing candidates removing themselves from the race. That happened a lot. Left-wing candidates have been very disciplined and very Republican in the sense that they are the biggest group in terms of the candidates who removed themselves from the race to prevent the election of a far-right candidate. So good job to them, and not as much of a good job to Macron's candidates, because when you compare the numbers, they did not remove themselves from the race as much as the left-wing candidates. So yeah.
Oh, so they didn't remove themselves as much. But I think in the majority of places where the centrists came in third, they did remove themselves. Is that correct? So it does seem to me that sort of the whole tactical alliance has worked okay from both sides, because there was a worry that sort of centrist voters would say, oh, well, if it's between the left and the far right, we're going to go for the far right. And it seems like that hasn't happened.
Well, there are two things happened. A lot of pressure was put on those centrist candidates from activists, from feminists who were like, these are the emails, these are the phone numbers, please send them emails, call them, etc. So that was one thing. And the second thing is that even when the candidates, the centrist candidates removed themselves from the race, when we look at the percentage of centrist voters who voted for left-wing candidates, it's much lower than the percentage of left-wing voters who voted for a centrist or right-wing candidate, which was the case for me. I voted right-wing for the first time in my life, which was very traumatic, but we had to do it.
And so that was right-wing as in, was that Les Républicains that you were voting for? Was it them versus
Exactly.
the far right in your case?
Exactly.
And I suppose, two big stories here. So one is, the relative defeat of the far right. And then two, the fact that it's this left-wing alliance that has come out on top. And I mean, what's the implications of it being the left who came out on top, not Macron? And I suppose, can you talk a bit about their platform? What were they pledging and promising to the French people?
I guess there were, again, two things. Like, obviously, the message was we need to prevent the far right from getting to power. But at the same time, the left made sure that we had a program, that there were measures that people could, vote for something, not against something. So there were, for example, like the minimum wage, raising it to 1,600 euros, making education completely free, meaning that canteen would be free, that getting access to pencils, textbooks, etc., would be free as well. There was also a proposition to increase the amount of brackets for taxes, to make sure that we can increase the amount of taxes on those last little brackets, so the richest people. So these are all measures that were offered by the Popular Front, obviously removing the retirement reform that Macron pushed in a very undemocratic way in the past couple of years. So these were all measures that were pushed by the Popular Front, that were popular among the French people. And that's also the reason why they managed to get so many votes and so many seats.
What can happen now? Because there's no one is close to a majority in Parliament, and obviously there's a very big gap between all three groupings. So it doesn't seem like there's much in common between the Popular Front and Macron's Ensemble. Obviously, Macron is not going to go into agreement with the National Rally. So it does seem a bit insurmountable. What can possibly happen now? Or is sort of everyone just resigned to the idea that there will just be total gridlock potentially for a long time?
Yeah, I think that the victory that happened last night with the Popular Front being the leading force was symbolic more than the beginning of actual change, because as you said, when you look at the parliament, you have three big blocks that are pretty much the same size if they do alliances, etc. So it's going to be really, really hard to govern in that situation. I think that's why Emmanuel Macron said to his prime minister, Attal, you're going to stay around for a little bit. We're going to see what we're going to do there. I think one of the reasons why Emmanuel Macron chose to dissolve the assembly, the parliament, was also because maybe he was hoping that he could recreate this sort of centrist alliance that he came from, with getting more moderate left-wing people on board. So maybe that's what's going to happen. Maybe he's going to try to build alliances with more moderate left-wing people. Maybe not. We don't really know. That's a fear on the left also at the moment, meaning that the division that emerged before the elections, that emerged, for example, during the European elections between the Social Democrats and the radical left of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, maybe those divisions are going to reappear, and maybe we're going to see a movement towards, a more Keir Starmer, let's say, centrist type of left. So it's important to continue the fight, and that's why a lot of activists, a lot of organizations have said that this is not a victory. We need to continue fighting. And as you said as well, it's important to keep in mind that the National Rally has had the most vote in terms of vote, if you count each vote. And also, if you break down the left-wing alliance in parties, well, the National Rally remains the dominant party in Parliament. So it's important to keep in mind those figures. They've never had that many seats in Parliament. So we can say that it's also a victory for them. So yeah, the fight continues, and it's only a half victory, I would say.
It's interesting about the National Rally because obviously it's a defeat compared to expectations, but they still have increased their number of seats, haven't they, in Parliament? So they were on fewer before this election. So on one level, they can say this is still part of their long march towards entering French government.
Exactly. And there's another element as well is, the whole far-right narrative, the National Rally narrative is we're not the left, we're not the right, we're beyond that, we're anti-establishment. And what happened in the last few weeks is very establishment material. It sends very much this message of we're doing this Republican front, so we're all creating alliances from the radical left to the right. We're creating this bloc, so it fits their narrative so well. So there are also fears that the far right will be able to use that to become even more powerful. And when you look at the response of far right voters, when people announced that they were going to build alliances, they were going to create this Republican front, well, people on the far right became even more likely, they supported the far right even more. So it reinforces that vote, that anger.
Do you think it's likely that Macron will sort of call new elections at some point soon, sort of say this is ungovernable, no one can agree in Parliament, we're going to have to give this another go?
I honestly hope he won't, because people are angry, exhausted. We can't. Even before I was having this chat with a friend yesterday. I was like, what could he do to make the situation even worse? And honestly, yeah, maybe he could call a new election or something. Maybe he could say that he resigns. That's also something we've heard, but I'm not sure he will actually do it. We'll see. It's just chaos everywhere, to be honest. So we've went through decades of neoliberalism. We've went through a decade of Macron. People are angry. People, it's like, as I was saying in another interview, we've given them hatred, violence for decades and decades. So obviously this is going to come out as violence as well. The hatred is just redirected at minority groups through the far-right vote. The problem is Macron. He's been spreading that hatred with his policies, with these neoliberal policies, with the pushing the retirement reform without by bypassing all the democratic systems that we have. It's just so it's. I want to remain optimistic and look at all the mobilizations that happened, all the organization, all the groups that emerge out of nowhere in just a few days. I want to focus on that, because if you start to, look at all the like political games, etc., like it's probably going to become more and more chaotic. And I include the left in that, argument as well, because obviously the divisions that existed before they created the Popular Front are still there. And I mean, we're going to see how it's going to evolve, but everyone is calling for union. Everyone is, but in reality, there are a lot of tensions coming from Macron's policies as well. So we'll see.
For the first time, it could be very, very possible that the presidential election in 2027 is between Le Pen and Mélenchon, or whoever the far left or the left decides to put forward into that contest.
Don't say that to French people, because most of the campaign has been about saying, no, Mélenchon won't be the prime minister, because a lot of people are really, really scared about Mélenchon. And I was making the comparison between Mélenchon and Corbyn. The two have been demonized by the media, especially around anti-Semitism, with the support for the Palestinian cause. Mélenchon in particular, he's one of the most hated political personalities in France. So if you say that Mélenchon is going to be the prime minister or the next president, you're going to make a lot of people angry. So we'll see. That's one of the division existing in the left at the moment. The leading group in the New Popular Front is La France Insoumise, so France Unbowed, which is Mélenchon's party. So technically, they should be the one kind of leading the left-wing group. But we've seen some betrayals in the past few days, really hardcore betrayals. So there's a lot of drama happening at the moment. But again, that's why I prefer to look at the mobilizations that are still happening, the grassroots work that is being done both online and real life, because that was insane. It was the first time I was involved to that level. And it was the first time that I was like, wow, it works. It's not just something it's not performative. It's really, really working.
Pretty inspiring. Obviously, though, I suppose easier to sort of all unite against something, the far right, than when it sort of becomes uniting for something. We all know that's when all the real divisions emerge. Rachel Reeves has today given her first big speech as Chancellor of the Exchequer. The speech was billed as laying out Labour's plan for growth, but she began with a warning about Labour's inheritance.
I have repeatedly warned that whoever won the general election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. What I have seen in the past 72 hours has only confirmed that. Our economy has been held back by decisions deferred and decisions ducked. Political self-interest put ahead of the national interest. A government that put party first and country second. We face the legacy of 14 years of chaos and economic irresponsibility. That is why, over the weekend, I instructed Treasury officials to provide an assessment of the state of our spending inheritance so that I can understand the full scale of the challenge. And I will present this to Parliament before the summer recess.
It's interesting that this was sort of the first big point made in Rachel Reeves' speech. I saw people sort of online, I think this was quite a smart point actually, comparing this to the Conservatives in 2010, whereby sort of what George Osborne and David Cameron did the minute they got into government was say, we are here to clean up their mess. And they did, I have to say, quite effectively sort of instill in the minds of the British public that the financial crisis and all the problems afterwards were caused by Labour's overspending, which was obviously a lie. I mean, Labour's overspending. Labour didn't overspend. The crisis was caused by the deregulation of the banks. But because sort of the Tories just kept hammering home that, then it did sort of stick in people's minds. And I think Rachel Reeves is trying to say, just because the election's over doesn't mean we're going to stop all of our attacks on Tory chaos, because she wants the public to remember this for another 5-10 years. Fair enough. This is also very much in line with some briefings that we saw before the election, which was that while the Labour Party were ruling out, those 3 big taxes on national insurance, on income tax, on VAT, there were maybe a bunch of sort of tax tweaks that they were going to announce after they got into power. And it was suggested they might do that after saying, we've opened up the books, the situation is so dire, we're going to have to increase, for example, capital gains tax. Obviously, the darker side of this is also she's probably lowering expectations because she's saying, there's not much money, so benefits, the NHS, schools, don't expect them to get better too quickly, right? Which, I think is disappointing, but three things going on there. As I say, the speech was mainly about how Labour would achieve growth. On that front, Reeves said she would ensure financial stability by working with the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility. Always implicit here is that Liz Truss didn't work with the Office for Budget Responsibility. Reeves also said she would stick to her fiscal rules. Again, somewhat of a sort of reminder and a contrast with Liz Truss. Reeves also said she would make some future announcements about how to increase private investment in Britain, so some sort of question marks there. But the meatiest part of the speech was focused on planning.
Our antiquated planning system leaves too many important projects tied up for years and years in red tape before shovels even get in the ground. We promised to put planning reform at the centre of our political argument. And we did. We said we would grasp the nettle of planning reform. And we are doing so. Today, I can tell you that that work is underway. Over the weekend, I met with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister to agree the urgent action needed to fix our planning system. Today, alongside the Deputy Prime Minister, I am taking immediate action to deliver this Labour government's mission to kickstart economic growth and to take the urgent steps necessary to build the infrastructure that we need, including 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years.
To get Britain building, Reeves said mandatory housing targets for local authorities would be restored, the de facto ban on onshore wind would be lifted, and wind farms would be classed as critical national infrastructure that allows central government to override local objections. She also said the government would call in stalled projects involving new housing and data centres. So the implication there being that central government could give them the go-ahead despite local prevarication. This is all sort of to bypass the NIMBYs. And I personally think this is all pretty good stuff, right? It could go some way to get Britain building. But there was a bit of an elephant in the room, as in her speech, Reeves made no mention of whether the state would actually build anything itself. Now, a look at the history of post-war house building in Britain shows why that matters. The 1950s to the 1970s was the last time Britain succeeded in building over 300,000 homes a year, sometimes more than 400,000 homes a year. Now, in those decades, at least a third of housing was council homes, so built by the state. It was only once the state stopped building homes that house building languished at below 200,000 per year, and where it stayed for a very long time. The role of the state in building both houses and infrastructure was brought up in a question to Rachel Reeves from the BBC.
Do you consider yourself to be a YIMBY? Yes, in my backyard. And then in terms of both the house building and the green infrastructure investment, in history, we've only had this level of house building when the state has been involved. And around the world, the examples which you know of green infrastructure investment have co-invested with the public sector. Are you relying too much on the people behind me from the private sector to deliver this revolution? Will net investment still go down under your leadership at the Treasury?
First of all, I do support development, and I think as a constituency MP, I've done just that. We need the private sector to build homes. We're not going to be in the business of building those homes directly. We need the construction sector, the house building sector to build those homes. And we have announced today, the Deputy Prime Minister and myself, some homes that have been stalled that will now go forward. We've also committed to look at those stalled sites, those wider number of stalled sites, to see what housing we can take forward. But we're not going to let people off the hook. We want affordable housing. And we want housing for social rent as well, and that's an important part of the mix. So this is not a green light for any type of housing. We want, and I said in the speech, that the Deputy Prime Minister will take an interventionist approach to make sure that we've got the housing mix that our country needs, that our people need.
So the implication there seemed to be we will have some social housing, but essentially we're going to try and get the private sector to build it. So that is, that's how a large part of social housing is built at the moment. It's called Section 106. So you say, we will give you planning permission to build this block of flats, but only if you make 30% of the housing provision affordable. Now, it really matters if you say affordable or if you say social rent, because affordable often just means 80% of market rent. Social housing, obviously, much cheaper and also much more secure, in terms of you can put, if you've got people on your waiting list, you can put them there. Whereas affordable housing can mean that you can get one of those shared mortgages, and it's all very complicated and doesn't necessarily sort of lower those waiting lists of the people currently waiting for social housing. And I say the waiting list of people currently, there are loads of people who aren't on the housing waiting list who would love a council house if it were possible. I'd love to, live somewhere like Vienna, where all of us could live in council homes. Ash, what do you make of Rachel Reeves' first big intervention? Basically, she's saying, we're going to go all out for growth, but we can't spend much money. Therefore, we're going to hope to do most of it via planning reform.
So write this down, because this is going to be really important for looking at the first 100 days of Keir Starmer's government. Every time he or Rachel Reeves or Angela Rayner or whoever it is announces a policy, I want you to categorise it under one of two columns. Is it cheap or is it spenny? Right? Ripping up planning regulations, that falls under the rubric of cheap. It's a cheap thing to do. Now, I'm not saying it's going to change nothing. Obviously, the length of the planning application process adds to the cost of building significantly. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but that's cheap. When you're looking at some of the most entrenched problems in the UK, a lot of them require expensive solutions. So take, for instance, staff retention in the public sector. So the NHS or the state education system. If you can only resolve that through a pay increase, that's spenny. If you want to deal with the fact that, nearly 1 in 5 local authorities are self-reporting that they are fairly or very likely to be bankrupt in the next 12 months, that there's a shortfall in local authority spending to the tune of billions of pounds, that would come under the column of spenny. So just every time there's a policy announcement, go cheap or spenny, because lots and lots and lots and lots of cheap reforms, they might have some impact, but they don't add up to the equivalent of one very spenny reform. And I think that this is a perfect case in point, because yes, dealing with the planning system, making it a lot more difficult to oppose the building of new housing, that's going to make a difference to house building. But the rate at which the private sector builds housing in this country, it's been relatively stable since the 60s. All right, it goes up when the economy's good, it goes down when the economy's bad, but you don't have massive shocks to it, apart from around the coronavirus pandemic. Right, but it takes a big external shock to change it. What changed the overall headline figure of homes being built was when we stopped building council housing. So in the 1960s, you had some years where you had over 400,000 new homes being built every year. Half of them would have been council tenure. Now, not all of them were well built, not all of them were nice, but not all of it was horrible either. And I think that when you're in a situation where, in the 1950s, so this isn't even in the era of, the prefab concrete monstrosity, but in the 1950s, when you've got, in a normal year, 147,000 council homes being built, you go, yeah, that's a good year. The state can do stuff. And if you want to look at a time where you had the private sector building houses at a comparable rate, you're really looking at Victorian times. You're literally looking at 1860, 1870, 1880, around that time, because it was basically a free-for-all. You had a massive transfer of populations from rural areas to the cities, which had industrialized. And so you had these, massive private house builders just building rows of terrace houses basically anywhere. Now, geographically, the country we live in now looks very different. You can't just say, all right, we're going to leave it all in the hands of the private sector. And if we just make planning a lot easier, if we create circumstances which are more similar to how it was in 1880, they're going to build at the same rate. They're not going to. The circumstances are totally and utterly different. So I think that there should be a big role for council housing here. The reason why it isn't happening is because that comes under the spenny problem. So we're left with this thing which is called planning. And that's the thing about mandatory targets, is that unless it's a guarantee, it's just a number.
I totally agree with you. I class myself pretty much as a left YIMBY, so I think we need to build shed loads more houses and kind of more everything, high-speed rail, more houses. I want us to expand our universities. I think, build that big strip between Oxford and Cambridge so we can have more science parks. I think build. But I also think the state should be doing a lot of the building instead of just begging private developers to sort of fulfill all the needs that the state has. They say, well, we'll let you build this as long as you have a few social housing units which have a separate door. That doesn't seem particularly ideal or ambitious to me. I'd say the state should be building shed loads while making it also easier for private industry also to build. The key thing here potentially, because they haven't really gone for wholesale planning reform. Wholesale planning reform would be to say we're going to completely change the fact that you sort of have this judicial system whereby you apply for each individual development, and then the council sort of looks at each one separately and can accept it or reject it. A more sort of radical type of planning reform would be to say, if your housing development meets these requirements, the windows are the right size, it's safe, and it's near enough a train station, you can build it, right? That would be radical planning reform. The Labour Party seem to be suggesting that the big change really is that the state's going to be a bit more proactive in terms of saying, if there is a local authority which is saying no, the state will sort of look at a lot of these and say, actually, yes, you might be, the local authority might be taking into account the interests of local homeowners, but they're not taking into account the interests of the wider nation and people who don't yet have houses. So we're overriding them. I think that's a good thing. I like that, but I agree with you, Ash, that the state should also be more proactive in terms of building council homes where they're needed. It doesn't seem to me a particularly radical position. In terms of NIMBYs, they really do exist. Someone who wasn't pleased with Reeves' speech was Tory MP Nigel Huddleston. So he tweeted this afterwards. Today, Rachel Reeves announced Labour's changing to planning and housing and name-checked a proposed site at Worcestershire Parkway within my Droitwich and Evesham constituency. During the election campaign, I expressed grave concerns about Labour's instincts to make top-down decisions that impact the countryside from offices in Whitehall. The local voice should not be ignored. He goes on, while we all know we need more housing, it has to be in the right place, on the right scale, and with appropriate supporting infrastructure. Let's also be clear we are talking about building on fields, not previously developed land or brownfield sites here too. I shall be seeking further information and assurances from Labour ministers in the coming weeks and would welcome views from local residents. So he's basically saying, all of you NIMBYs, please email me so I can show the Secretary of State that you don't want any housing here. Now on Google Maps, you can look up this place, the site that Nigel Huddleston is so desperate to keep housing free. Pinned in the middle of this image is the train station, Worcestershire Parkway. Next to it is a recycling plant. You've also got a distribution centre, quite a small college, I think. And then if you zoom out, it's just surrounded by miles and miles of empty fields. Of course, though, we couldn't possibly stand to have any much needed housing there. We need those fields to remain empty. We need the distribution centre to continue to have nice views of uninterrupted countryside. I personally think it's somewhat ridiculous. Build the goddamn houses. Someone who was more pleased to hear Reeves's announcements was Ed Miliband. He put out this video on social media.
I've just come from the Treasury. The onshore wind ban in England has been in place for more than 9 years. We've been in government 72 hours. We've lifted it. That's the pace we're going to move at. We've got to become a clean energy superpower, for energy independence, to cut bills, to create good jobs, and tackle the climate crisis. We're getting on with it.
Very good message. And I think this, lifting the ban on onshore wind turbines as sort of the thing you do in the first 72 hours, really good. Right. And not only doing that, saying because the de facto ban was introduced by David Cameron basically to appease his NIMBY backbenchers. Onshore wind is much cheaper than offshore wind. That's why it's a good idea to allow it. I also, when I go on like a train journey and I pass those sort of like onshore wind farms, it makes me feel really positive, because I think they are quite beautiful, I think. And also you feel like, oh, fantastic, we're doing something about climate change, and it makes me feel a little bit more relaxed inside. So I would like to see more onshore wind farms around the country for my own emotional well-being. But they've also said, as well as ending the ban, they will make this a proper site of national infrastructure, national importance, which means that presumably Ed Miliband, if a local council says, we don't want these, it ruins our views of the empty fields or it disturbs some of the birds, he can say, I don't really care. The country needs more wind. We need more power. Sorry, get over it. Which again, I'm pretty much in favour of. In terms of other announcements made in the first 72 hours of this government, Keir Starmer said on Saturday that the Rwanda plan was dead. But today, Yvette Cooper gave less clarity on the migrants being housed on the Bibi Stockholm.
Well, we need to clear the Conservatives' asylum backlog, but the first priority has to be to get their stronger border security in place. And that's why our first step is setting up the new Border Security Command.
So for now, you'll keep on using that barge?
Well, we want to clear the Conservatives' asylum backlog. It is chaos and it is costing the taxpayer billions. So that work needs to get going. But our first priority is to make sure that we can get the Border Security Command up and running to strengthen our border security and deal with the criminal gangs that are organising these dangerous boat crossings.
This is an area where I'm really unsure what Labour are planning, because basically their policy, other than scrapping Rwanda, their policy is really not at all different from the Conservatives, which is just to sort of say, oh, if we tackle the gangs, if we be really tough on the gangs, then we can stop people crossing, which I just don't see how it works. Like that's what the Conservatives were trying to do. Right, that's kind of the easy thing to say. What you'd have to do to make a real difference is have like a returns agreement with France, where you say if people cross the channel, we can send them back to France. Now, to make that work, I would assume that the French government, who already have sort of the far right nipping at their heels, they're going to say, okay, well, we're only going to take back migrants if you take some of ours, and that's politically difficult. So I don't really see how the Labour Party are planning to make this work. I can definitely imagine Nigel Farage sort of really, really enjoying going down to those beaches on the south coast and saying, Labour haven't stopped people crossing the channel. And I don't think Labour have a plan to make any of this work. So I don't get it. We'll wait to see. Turning to international affairs, there is one piece of good news. Labour have made it clear they will drop the Tory government's defence of Israel at the International Criminal Court. Rishi Sunak's government had lodged a challenge to the ICC, arguing that it did not have jurisdiction over the Palestinian territories. Labour's position is that the ICC does have jurisdiction, and so it will drop its opposition to Netanyahu's arrest warrant. That's a bit of a bare minimum thing when it comes to Palestine, to sort of stop doing the Tories' sort of completely atrocious move of telling the ICC that they can't investigate what's going on in Palestine. Still, it's better than what the Conservatives were doing. Ash, I want your thoughts sort of generally on those sort of moves I've just talked about, but also Keir Starmer's first 72 hours as Prime Minister.
Well, let's start with, dropping Britain's objection to the ICC investigation of Netanyahu for war crimes. I don't think that this would have happened had Labour not lost out on some seats to pro-Gaza independents. So Jeremy Corbyn, obviously, in Islington North, but you also had Blackburn, Dewsbury and Batley, and of course Leicester South, where you shock loss of Jonathan Ashworth, who really, I think, thought he was untouchable. I mean, he had a really, really big majority. And I think he was so confident. He was, almost entirely seconded to the business of, bomb-proofing the manifesto. I think that Keir Starmer really thought that he was going to be in his cabinet. And so I think unless those things had happened, you wouldn't have seen such a quick move here. Because don't forget, when South Africa was first lodging its case with the ICJ, accusing Israel of carrying out a genocide and genocidal acts, the position of the Labour front bench in one voice was to say, oh, this is just a distraction. It's pointless. There's no reason to do it. Really, they ended up in a position where they were just completely undermining the institutions of international law and undermining the principle that where there are plausible accusations of genocide, that the international community have a responsibility, a legal duty to intervene. That was their position earlier in the year. Now, I think that that's changed for political reasons. How Labour navigate this situation where they are losing much of their Muslim vote and also much of their younger, more left-wing, more urban vote. And by urban, I'm not using that as like code for black and brown. I mean, literally living in cities. there's a longer question, there's a deeper question there, and the answers I think are going to play out over a longer time. I imagine that there's a great deal of disagreement internally within Keir Starmer's camp. Some probably agree with John McTernan, who said, look, when you're losing, Muslims over Gaza the way that we are, we have to take it as seriously as we took the loss of the Red Wall. I'm sure that there are people who say, no, that was acceptable collateral to win back swing voters, or at least make Tory voters feel that it was safe enough to stay at home and not turn out for the Conservative Party. I imagine that that's something which is being argued. But yeah, don't get it twisted. I think the fact that objection has been dropped to the ICC is a product of the political result that we saw unfold last week. I think when it comes to immigration, asylum, and small boats in particular, you reminded me of something, which is that the small boats crisis was driven in no small part initially by Nigel Farage literally turning up day after day at the South Coast, filming small boats arriving and creating a media event out of it. And I think that this might be where Labour find themselves vulnerable, because they don't want to make the point that, okay, you can really deal with a lot of small boats crossings by expanding safe and legal routes. Like, I think all of us would agree that people who are fleeing the Taliban, or, people who are fleeing political persecution in Iran, they've got the right to come here. They've got a good reason to come here and claim asylum, that they should be offered safe and legal routes. You would take away the demand for unsafe, dangerous small boats crossings like that, right? Labour don't want to make that point, that they're scared it's going to make them vulnerable to being attacked by, Reform or the Conservatives or whoever it is. I think that that's a complacent attitude, because you're going to be attacked on it either way. If you do this thing where you sort of go competence and inshallah, like, okay, well, we're going to make processing asylum claims faster. We're going to crack down on the criminal gangs. But Nigel Farage is still turning up, at a beach on the Kent coast, with an Osmo every single day. That's going to keep the story going. That's how he catapulted it into prominence in the first place. And I suppose for your last question, which is, the first 72 hours of Keir Starmer's government, we're going to talk about more of those appointments later. But I think it comes down to, where are you going to see change, and where are you either not going to see change, or Keir Starmer's government are going to have to be pushed very, very hard to adopt it. If it's cheap, you are going to see reforms, I think. There will be some things which are substantively different, as long as they don't cost money. If they're expensive, if they require shifting where the tax burden falls, or finding new taxes, or borrowing substantive sums, that is going to be an absolutely uphill struggle with Starmer's government.
And that's absolutely right. And I think that's going to be actually the big story of the government, whether you're from the left or the right or whoever. It's just sort of how much can they do on the cheap, because they've made the whole point that sort of we are, the mandate they got was somewhat small, 34% or whatever. Now the challenge is to deliver, and how much can they deliver without spending much money is a question that I think no one really knows the answer to at this point. Keir Starmer's new cabinet doesn't contain many surprises, and in nearly all the major departments, shadow cabinet members have kept on in their respective roles to become cabinet members. One exception is Emily Thornberry. She was Shadow Attorney General, but has been passed over for this man. Richard Hermer KC is a prominent lawyer who worked at Keir Starmer's old chambers, and his appointment appears to have been welcomed by the human rights community. That's in part because he has taken generally decent positions on Palestine. Hermer has been a strong critic of Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. He's given evidence against the anti-BDS bill in Parliament, and in October, he told LBC this: "In respect to the siege, it is important to understand the context here. Gaza is called the Gaza Strip because it is a very small strip of land with over 2 million people crowded into it, nearly half of whom are children. Sieges have been used and identified as part of international law for a long time. Sieges per se of military personnel might not be contrary to international law, but it is almost impossible to conceive of how a siege that deprives a civilian population of the basic necessities of life is in compliance with international law." So he's saying very clearly now, the siege on Gaza, there's no way that can be legal in international law. Now, compare that answer to the person he has replaced.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
Of course, Emily Thornberry in that interview was defending an equally egregious statement by Keir Starmer. So presumably she didn't lose her job because of it. And probably that was because she briefed that Keir Starmer was boring, or that's what I'm led to believe. Of course, that all means we'll wait to see whether Hermer's appointment represents any genuine shift on the question of Palestinian rights. Another appointment which has been broadly welcomed is that of James Timpson as Minister for Prisons. James Timpson is the founder of the Timpson chain, which offers dry cleaning, key cutting and shoe repairs. But it's not the services the chain offers that is notable, but rather who it employs, 10% of whom are former prisoners. And the firm is generally known for its social principles. This is a common sign outside its shops. If you are unemployed and need an outfit cleaned for an interview, we will clean it for free. So again, a good sentiment. He says, when times are tough, we will help you look your best. So fairly impressive guy. Timpson was also, until his appointment, chair of the Prison Reform Trust. And earlier this year, he explained his philosophy on prisons to Krishnan Guru Murphy.
We're addicted to sentencing. We're addicted to punishment. So many of the people who are in prison, in my view, shouldn't be there. A lot should, but a lot shouldn't. And they're there for far too long. Far too long. And that's just getting worse and worse. I meet people in prison regularly who are serving sentences longer than they've ever been alive for already. And I just think it's just, this is common sense being ignored, evidence being ignored, because there is this sentiment around punish and punish.
How would you change that?
I would just look at the evidence. So let me give you an example in Holland, which I know lots of people like to use the Dutch as an example. They've shut half their prisons, not because people are less naughty in Holland, it's because they've got a different way of sentencing, which is community sentencing. So people can stay at home, keep their jobs, keep their homes, keep reading their kids' bedtime stories. And it means that they're far less likely to commit crime again.
I mean, it's a cultural thing around punishment, isn't it? That we are kind of stuck in a sort of a Victorian mindset.
Yeah.
In a way. You've done something wrong, therefore you must pay the price.
Yeah, and a custodial sentence is not always the right thing for people. I mean, in very crude terms, and you'll get people who completely disagree with me on this, we have 85,000 people in prison. It's going to go up to 100,000 pretty soon. A third of them should definitely be there. There's another third in the middle, which probably shouldn't be there, but they need some other kind of state support. A lot of them have got massive mental health issues. They've been in prison, in and out of prison all their lives. And then there's another third, and there's a large proportion of women. Prison is a disaster for them because they're just putting them back in the offending cycle.
What to do about Britain's prisons is actually one of the first big calls Keir Starmer will have to make. The prison estate is set to reach full capacity on the 1st of August, which could trigger the early release of up to 40,000 inmates. In his first Downing Street press conference on Saturday, Starmer said his overall philosophy was that Britain has too many prisoners, but not enough prisons. So essentially sort of saying, I will build more prisons because we need more space, but then let's put fewer people in them. I suppose, more prisons and less prisoners is better than more prisoners and fewer prisons, which is what the Conservatives have offered. Ash, we'll talk about some other appointments in a moment. First of all, on these two, they do seem interesting and to some degree promising.
You know what? I feel really bad about something. Because when Richard Hermer was announced in the Attorney General role, I hadn't slept and I was delirious and finding the stupidest stuff funny. And because I saw a bald man wearing glasses, my brain immediately went, Greg Wallace. And then as soon as the idea struck me that Greg Wallace had been appointed Attorney General, that was gone. I was thinking about how Labour were appealing to their buttery biscuit base. I was thinking, law doesn't get tougher than this. I really went for it. So I'm sorry that was my first and only comment about Richard Hermer being appointed.
Distinguished lawyer, Ash.
I know. But you know what? I hadn't slept for a really, really long time. I think with these two appointments, again, the James Timpson stuff is really interesting. He falls into that camp of people who liberal reformers really love because he is essentially a liberal reformer. Now, that's not me saying it in a snide way. I think that the prison system, the criminal justice system, really could do with a lot of liberal reform. What we have had in this country is a crackdown model, which I think weakens the sort of social bonds which are capable of preventing crime and other forms of disorderly antisocial behavior as much as they operate as a punishment and a deterrent. We've got absolutely terrible recidivism rates in this country, and that's when you compare it to other Western European countries, particularly in Scandinavia. They've got a completely different approach. The idea of having someone like James Timpson, sorry to bring it back to my 2 columns, Michael, but that's a cheap reform. It's a very cheap reform indeed. And Richard Hermer, I mean, look, he's eminently qualified, certainly qualified for the job, but there's a political calculation being made here too. I mean, I think about the pettiness of political operators. I think the fact that Emily Thornberry may or may not have been briefing against Keir Starmer, calling him boring, and perhaps trying to position herself for a leadership run. When Keir Starmer was looking quite weak, when Labour had lost that Hartlepool by-election. That's the kind of thing that Starmer and his team will have a long memory for, and that's how things work. You know what they say: if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. It's just a shame that after Emily Thornberry completely debased herself defending Keir Starmer's absolutely atrocious comments, defending the collective punishment of Gazan people, which we now know has resulted in genocidal acts. I mean, that wasn't even enough to secure her a job in a government. I thought it was sort of embarrassing, that statement, when she was like, disappointed and surprised, translation, mega pissed. So yeah, embarrassing for her. Real shame.
And I mean, it's especially, well, it's not a shame, but it's especially embarrassing because she's got no one on her side now, right? The Keir Starmer allies think she's a bit duplicitous and was, ready to sort of try and overthrow him at the first sign of weakness. And anyone on the left, critics of Keir Starmer, think she's a complete sellout because she went on television and said it's okay for Israel to collectively punish 1 million kids in Gaza, to defend Keir Starmer, who now has said that's not good enough, right? You still want it to topple me when times are tough. So yeah, I suppose you need to be loyal to someone in politics, and I suppose Emily Thornberry has probably only been loyal to herself, and it hasn't turned out very well. Not all of Starmer's appointments have been as inspired as the ones we've just talked about. Some give his new government a more retro flavour. The International Development Secretary under Gordon Brown, Douglas Alexander, has been appointed as a business minister, and former Home Secretary Jackie Smith will join the House of Lords to become a higher education minister. Smith's elevation to the Lords is controversial and has been opposed by, amongst others, Jackie Smith. In 2012, Smith told Question Time viewers she was a disgrace and shouldn't be made a peer. That was due to her role in the expenses scandal. In 2010, it was found Smith had declared her main property was a house she shared with her sister in London, which allowed her to claim tens of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' cash for her family home in Worcestershire. Another new Labour stalwart set to be brought back into the fold is Alan Milburn, who will help Wes Streeting implement NHS reform. Milburn was and remains a strong supporter of the private sector having an expanded role in the health service. Ash, we discussed some sort of inspired appointments. These ones are very much, Blair reloaded.
I mean, I think this is where you can see the sort of anti-democratic turn that liberalism has taken, because nobody voted for reheated Blairism. I mean, that's certainly not something which is particularly popular amongst the electorate. And, neither Alan Milburn or Jackie Smith have been elected in this parliament. And so in order to sort of have this zombie-like resurrection of that, right-wing Labour project, you have to turn to, non-democratic means to get these people into your government. I mean, look, Jackie Smith saying, look, I'm I'm disgraced. I shouldn't be in the House of Lords, and then, being in the House of Lords and being brought back into the Starmer project. I mean, that sort of speaks for itself in terms of the hypocrisy of politicians. They come out with all these fine principles when it serves them and is politically advantageous in one moment, and then they ditch them the next. I mean, so far so Brownite. But I think Alan Milburn is the really interesting one here, because not only was he a sort of he was a real ideological bedfellow of Tony Blair, one of those leading lights of the Blairite project. He first came to Parliament in 1992. His constituency, Darlington, was right next to Tony Blair. They were close. They worked really closely together. And after his time as an MP, when he was no longer in the government, he spent a lot of time sort of, first floating around this like centre left, centre right position. There were all these rumours that David Cameron was going to appoint him to the Lords so then he could bring him into his coalition government. They never manifested, but that tells you something about how he was being perceived at the time. And up until very recently, his job was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he was advising the firm on how they could make the most out of, and I quote, the UK healthcare market. So these aren't positions either held by, Jackie Smith or Alan Milburn, which are popular amongst the electorate. I mean, that's probably why they're not MPs anymore. And I think that it's another way in which, in order to restore Blairism to the highest echelons of the Labour Party itself has had to bypass democratic means. I think there's a PhD in that somewhere. If only I could be bothered to write it.
We are not losing you to some social science department to write a PhD, Ash. So you're going to have to keep that one in your head. Any viewers, I suppose, are our viewers free to steal that idea if they're applying for a PhD, Ash?
Yeah, go for it. I just want to stay here on Monday nights. I don't want to do a fucking PhD. I want to hang out with you.
Oh, that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you so much, Ash, for joining me tonight. And thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.